Hi, my name is Mike Emanuel, Chief Washington Correspondent for Fox News. I do a little anchoring as well, and I am honored to be here with this distinguished panel, bipartisan, dare I say fair and balanced. We've got a fascinating group of experts and some brilliant academics, and so my job is to keep the conversation moving, keep it interesting. We don't want to be boring in television, right, John Dickerson? So let's start with Francis Lee from Princeton University. Full disclosure, Francis, I went to the Harvard of Central New Jersey, Rutgers University, but I hope we're cool. So your essay was Polarization, Weak Presidents, and the Continuing Necessity for Bipartisanship. What are the big points that we should all take away from that?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to Bill Antholis and the Miller Center for convening this terrific group, this diverse and fair and balanced group. It's not often the case in my line of work that I get to participate in a group this politically diverse. So it's of unique value. My piece centers on the political weakness of presidents in the polarized era. Start from the simple fact that presidential elections in the polarized era are persistently close. It's a 50-50 country. What this means is that presidents face strong opposition from day one. Polarization puts a low ceiling on their public support. Most of the time, presidents spend their time in office below 50% in terms of public approval. Geographic polarization complicates the task even more. The rigid red versus blue state map that we have seen since 2000, something my students often think is just a permanent fact of American politics. It hasn't always existed, but it structures the reality that presidents face. They have little or no leverage over representatives and senators of the opposing party. They don't carry their states and districts, and so when these members of Congress are seeking to represent the constituencies that elected them, they see it as their task to oppose the presidents of the opposing party. But with that, with those circumstances in place, presidents are still faced with the task of building the necessary bipartisan support to legislate. So even though the political lay of the land makes it extraordinarily difficult for them to do so, the constitutional system remains in place and demands that they find a way. Bipartisanship is almost always necessary for legislative success. Very little passes Congress any other way. Most legislation, including most important legislation, gets majorities of both parties in support. In the typical Congress, 100% of every important law that passes gets at least 10% support from the minority party. So when you think about the salient examples of presidents delivering on some key campaign priorities like the Affordable Care Act or the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, it's important to keep in mind that those are extraordinarily unusual and rare legislative achievements. In general, bipartisanship is always necessary for presidents to succeed. That's the case because of divided government. That is the normal state of affairs in the polarized, closely competitive era. 2/3 of the time, we have national government divided with divided control between the parties. Under conditions when you have ostensible unified control, presidents still have to contend with the filibuster in the Senate, which will require bipartisanship even under conditions when a party seems to have full control. And third, and this often gets this factor often gets underestimated given the type of political rhetoric we typically hear in campaigns, but the parties are not nearly as internally unified as they want you to think they are. And in conjunction with the narrow majorities that parties possess, they often fall short of the full consensus that's necessary to legislate. And so every president with unified government has seen at least one complete flame out in terms of a legislative initiative that failed entirely. So think the effort to repeal and replace Obamacare. Think Social Security reform under George W. Bush. So think of climate change under Obama. And of course, the Build Back Better plan under Biden. So all these presidents where they would seem to have the sufficient opportunity to legislate on their agendas fall short, in part because of the narrow majorities and the internal diversity of their parties. So generally, presidents find that their party agenda items get blocked or watered down in Congress. This tempts them towards unilateral action, which then in turn gets bogged down or overturned in the courts. This does not, however, mean that nothing is getting done. There's a tendency to think that because presidents can't deliver on their party agenda items, on their campaign promises, that nothing is happening in Congress. I think that's just a conventional wisdom that's really at odds with reality. The volume of legislative output is high, and it has not declined since the 70s and the 80s. If you're looking at the amount of legislation passed in each Congress. The COVID period was just extraordinary in terms of legislative activism. Congress and the president worked together to allocate $5 trillion, as Phil Zelikow mentioned. You're talking about 25% of GDP in 2020. It's roughly equivalent to the level of expenditures as in World War II. But it's not just COVID. I mean, there's been a great deal of legislative action across all the recent Congresses. You've had ongoing investments in clean energy well before the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act. Prior to the IRA, the most important clean energy package that Congress had passed was in the 2020 omnibus. You had a major parks and wilderness bill. You have the investments in science and in microchips. You have the Electoral Count Act reform, which cleared after the 2020 elections in the lame duck to address major challenges in ambiguity around the electoral count that follows presidential elections. You have a new North American Free Trade Agreement, one supported by labor, which is an extraordinary achievement. Paid parental leave for federal workers has been enacted. Major copyright reform. So Congress is not paralyzed. Even though it's perceived that way. To a great extent, I think this is a function of news coverage which focuses on conflict and enactments that garner bipartisan support, like all the ones I just listed, are boring and get very little news attention. So Congress does a lot, it's just not a lot that isn't bipartisan. So just to wrap up then the key points, polarization, especially geographic polarization, weakens presidents. Their unilateral tools are a poor substitute for legislating. This is especially true in domestic affairs. But those unilateral tools are often all that presidents have to work with, given the political weakness that they struggle with.
Quick follow-up. It seems to me that when you're in power, there's temptation to get rid of the legislative filibuster in the Senate, the 60-vote threshold, so you can steamroll your agenda through. But it seems like that's imperative to keep the country from going way to the right when the right's in power and way to the left when the left's in power. Your thoughts? The
filibuster is an important constraint on partisanship and on an ability of a president to push through or steamroll a partisan agenda. But I think it is often overrated because you see under the cases where a party has the opportunity through the use of budget reconciliation to push through a package without any bipartisan support, that's where the big flameouts happen. And so in many cases, I think a party is able to hold together and to pass messaging bills that have no chance to become law. But when it's in danger of actually happening, then they struggle with their own internal divides.
All right, thank you for that. Up next, it's my pleasure to introduce William Howell from the University of Chicago, who wrote an essay, The Rise of the Strongman Presidency. William, what are the key takeaways you want folks here and outside who are streaming from your essay?
Sure. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bill, and your team for assembling us and encouraging us to think anew about these institutions that we've inherited and how we might build a more effective government. I think tomorrow, I recognize tomorrow we're going to be talking a lot about solutions. It's worth keeping squarely in our minds what the problem is. There are lots of problems that one might focus on. Our essay puts what we think is the big problem, which is the health and well-being of our democracy, which lots of people, not just us alone, recognize as being in crisis. Our democracy is on its heels right now, and that is a general problem, but it's an acute problem when you think about the powers that are vested in the presidency and the possibility for a strongman presidency to arise and to unravel our democracy and to push back against the norms and rules that govern justifiably our country. And we want to think about then where that strongman presidency comes from. And so the story that we tell comes in 3 acts, and in every act, the administrative state is implicated. And so it goes roughly as follows. This is not just a story about this present moment where Trump drops out of the sky and suddenly shakes things up. This is a story that goes back decades. And it begins with the emergence of the administrative state, which to our mind is the single most important state-building activity, most significant state-building activity of our nation's history that Sid and Rachel talked about in their essay. And that is a story that led to the expansion of presidential power because it created all kinds of capacity and resources that Democratic and Republican presidents alike could leverage. And they spent much of the 20th century building apparatuses of control, starting with the Reorganization Act and the creation of the EOP, but going forward in order to try to grab hold of this administrative state to ensure or to increase the odds that bureaucrats will do the bidding of presidents and not the biddings of others. That's imperfect, but the apparatuses of control led to a broad expansion of presidential power, and that is, as we tell it, a symmetric story. It's one that implicates Democrats and Republicans alike. There's an asymmetric story that's also worth underscoring, which is that the administrative state was born of the New Deal and the Great Society, and it was built by Democrats in order to attend to progressive objectives. And the growth that we've seen in the administrative state over time, where we've seen the growth is in investments of authority and capacity in the service of objectives that Democrats like and that Republicans don't like. And for a long time, conservatives in particular within the Republican Party have looked upon this administrative state as a problem. It's a thing that isn't just a constitutional problem, it's a thing that year in and year out is attending to objectives with which they disagree. And so increasingly over time, what we've seen is the Republican Party generally and conservatives within it trying to look for ways to marginalize and limit the activities of the administrative state that's attending to progressive objectives. And the story, Rachel brought up the unitary executive theory, the story of the unitary executive theory, which is making extraordinary claims on behalf of presidential power, is born of this precise problem. It's a recognition that we're not going to be able to roll back the administrative state through Congress, through the courts. The administrative state isn't going to, on its own, curtail its own ambitions. The solution here is to build a massively more powerful presidency, one that is born of this basic problem as conservatives see it, which is we have this administrative state attending to progressive objectives. So we have these two things layered on top of one another, an asymmetric logic, a symmetric logic that implicates both parties, and this asymmetric logic where conservatives increasingly make the strongest claims on behalf of presidential power in order to attend to these issues of an administrative state attending to objectives with which they disagree. Then there's the third act is an act that it involves something that we haven't talked about at all yet is coursing through our politics. It's not just a story of rising levels of polarization. It's the rise of populism within our politics. And populism, which is decidedly anti-institutional, and which represents, in our view, a distinct threat to the well-being of our democracy. And that populism has its eyes set on grabbing hold of these extraordinary powers vested in the executive branch, which are limited when it comes to, decidedly limited when it comes to the legislative process. And yet, there's all kinds of unilateral powers which, from a good government perspective, are decidedly problematic, but that can be used for decidedly anti-democratic ends. And that the confluence of these three things, this symmetric logic, rise of administrative state, this increasing claims for vastly more power, articulated predominantly by conservatives in the service of unwinding and sabotaging and marginalizing the administrative state, coupled with the rise of populism, puts the presidency squarely as a potential threat to the health and well-being of our democracy. That's where we get the rise of the strongman presidency. And anything we're going to do, if we're going to talk about the problems that we as a country face and what to do about the presidency, in our view, ought to keep these concerns squarely in mind.
I covered the Bush and Obama White Houses. I remember President George W. Bush doing charm offensives with prominent Democrats like Senator Ted Kennedy, now the late Senator Ted Kennedy, and Nancy Pelosi. And I think he was frustrated that those efforts at outreach did not produce better results for him. And then I remember with President Obama, when he got frustrated with Congress, he said, well, I've got my pen and my phone, and basically I can work around you guys. Is that tension between the White House and Capitol Hill inherent in our system?
The short answer is yes. All presidents want more power. All presidents facing constraints look for ways to work around those constraints in order to deliver. That's for sure true. And that is part and parcel of what we're again calling the symmetric logic. This is all presidents want power. But there is this asymmetric piece that, and it's born of the contempt conservatives have towards the administrative state. They look upon this administrative state, and they're not wrong to look upon the administrative state as attending to progressive objectives. They're not wrong in that way. But the claims that they make on behalf of a vastly more powerful presidency exceed those of Democrats because the challenge that they face is greater. How do you extricate this administrative state that's doing things with which you disagree? And again, that those two layers coupled with this rise of populism, watch out when you think about the health and well-being of a democracy.
Okay, so next up in our conversation, we have two recent veterans of the interaction between the White House and Capitol Hill, Louisa Terrell and Dan Meyer. Pleasure having both of you. Louisa, you led President Biden's legislative affairs team, so you're going to the Hill saying, here's what we need, here's what the president needs. It leads us to a broad question of, are we passing laws the right way?
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bill. Having just recently left the White House, it is a privilege to sort of rejoin the living world again with you all. So thank you on that. So look, I am in Francis's world of a positive productivity. So my view of this is that we are a resounding yes, that we are passing laws in the right way. I say that because I think there is a need for the ability to be nimble and look at some different ways of achieving some of your aims. And I think that what many of you all have already identified, sort of some of the dynamics that are being here, polarized. We have margins that are slim. And I think in that environment, you have to be a little innovative. So when I look back even over the last 2 years and having also served in President Obama's legislative shops, we're looking at that too as a point of comparison. In those times, I think we most recently saw sort of three ways of doing this, right? You had bipartisan gangs it is, it's now a very popular gang group. So looking at ways that was a bipartisan piece, where sometimes where both sides, maybe their eyes were bigger than their stomach, and so you have to come together, and we put together bipartisan groups. Again, not something that's particularly unusual. We've seen this over time, but I think that's become like a tool, given kind of the constraints that we're under. I do think we'd seen, obviously, most recently, there was using the reconciliation piece. I think Francis put this well. There is those strictly partisan tools for passing legislation, you have some risks of durability, right? We saw that with the Affordable Care Act. You have it's a risk you have on the back end. And then I also think we were sort of, and Dan and I lived through this, you get into some positions where you're in kind of a do or die situation, right? We were negotiating on the debt ceiling. You're in an environment where you have a deadline on the appropriations bill, and we need to come together. What I look at that as someone who's very, very fond and very respectful of Congress, the thing that comes away as a tool, the way in which we sort of grew up understanding how a bill became law was really about through committees, about a certain kind of process that happened. You had a lot of members that would be engaged in this process, a lot of back and forth. Because you have kind of more of a constrained environment, and you look at those three major pathways that we've used, I think what happens is you have a lot of members who have deep expertise or deep care about this, and they're not necessarily part of the give and take and the sausage making, as it were, in these three. And I think that creates challenges, both for leadership, the back and forth, the understanding of the relationship between Congress and the president, because you don't have kind of that fulsome piece of them coming together. But I think under the constraints and the factors that we've talked about a little bit this morning, that I think we are still in a place where there are pathways to be forged, and a positive one.
All right. So Dan, as former Chief of Staff to Speaker Kevin McCarthy and Speaker Newt Gingrich, and did some ledge affairs for President Bush 43. You've had Louisa and others come into your office and say the president's got to have this, president needs this, and you're dealing with a lot of other factors as well, herding cats in Congress. What about the dynamics there in terms of working with a president from the other party, your party, and the other aspects you're dealing with on Capitol Hill?
So all those, thank you. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Bill. And I'm going to start by saying I retired at the end of June. It's been 3 months since I've been in a room that talked about the evils of the administrative state. That's not what I was expecting here today. It was a weekly meeting when the House Republicans got together. So for those of you who are talking about that, you're right. That's a big issue, and it even in the halls of Congress, it gets talked about a lot. And that's not what I was expecting. But anyway. In terms of working, so my time with Newt the president was Bill Clinton. My time with working with Josh and for President Bush, the Democrats controlled Congress. I came to the Bush White House after the 2006 election, and then of course with Kevin, it was divided government with Republicans in the minority with President Trump, and then Republicans in the majority with President Biden. I feel like divided government is kind of my niche, and
what you do.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess one of the things that I point out to people is you can't really do divided government if you're not even going to make the effort to understand the other side's point of view. Mm-hmm. And if you do try to understand the other side's point of view, you can actually come to agreement. I mean, you don't get everything you want, that classic kind of compromising stuff. That has become so much harder, in my judgment, and it goes down to what the last panel was talking about. I think Josh said, we're polarized because people are polarized, and it's absolutely true, and evidenced by the polling numbers that were mentioned about, where violence is appropriate or perceiving the other side as evil. That manifests itself in Congress because, and it's not that most of the members think that way, but it's what they face when they go home. And so I've told, I personally evidence this. I went and spoke to a group of county Republicans at one point in North Carolina, and was asked to do that when I was going to be down there anyway. And it was the biggest group in North Carolina, and you know, this was September of 2021, 9 months into the Biden administration, and I'm giving, you know, there's been a bad election for Republicans in 2020, lost the White House, lost the Senate. The one good news story is House Republicans picked up seats. You know, historically, as everyone knows, the party out of the White House does pretty well in the next midterm, so we were optimistic, talking about the commitment to America, all that sort of stuff. You know, rose-colored glasses, little speech. First question. Why haven't you impeached Joe Biden? This, you know, Republicans, and it's like, okay, I'm not an elected official. I don't have to, you know, I don't have to humor these people. I said, well, you know, it'd be stupid. We spent a lot of time talking about how inappropriate it was for various reasons, the way it was done under for President Trump. And by the way, Republicans are in the minority in the House, and you know, it was like, well, you're not fighting hard enough. And the next question was on vaccine mandates. You're not fighting hard enough. This is what members face whenever they go back and meet with their activist base. And some of the papers talked about, you know, how we've evolved into really having to take care of the bases, and so that kind of permeates it. And when Bob concluded his closing remarks was saying, you know, what problems should we be studying and, you know, trying to find solutions. My number one would be polarization. I mean, how did we get here, and is there anything we can do about it? Because it does permeate through through Congress and the presidency and trying to get things done. I will agree with Louisa. More gets done than people acknowledge, and it's certainly, I've been through, you know, episodically kind of what would be perceived as crisis moments. I was running legislative affairs for President Bush when TARP came about, and was with McCarthy for COVID, and of course most recently the debt limit, which, you know, most people wanted to avoid a default, not everybody. But the problem that we run into, and you know, reading the papers, I think people nailed it quite well. Your talk about the fight against, you know, progressive big government and the populist movement and people seeing it as a corrupt, illegitimate system. That is what, you know, percolates up, and it creates challenges because, you know, the one thing that drove me crazy about, and this is not comment on his current how he approached government, but one of the things early on when Jordan was fighting Boehner back in those days, was his favorite line was, let's just do what we said we'd do. Well, I mean, the last panel talked about the promises and the fictive versus factual that Phil talked about, and then so that gets presented, and then all of a sudden you're held to a standard that you have to enact the fictive, and it creates an impossible situation to legislate and to actually work together if people take that position. And it happens, you know, the whole fighting thing. I see it, obviously saw it a lot on the Republican side, but the fellow who won the special election for the guy who became lieutenant governor of New York, Ryan, he said, you know, what did he take away from his campaign? People want us fighting, or people want us fighting. And it's, you know, we got to be where, at the staff level, that we would, you know, we'd come out of Republican conferences and, you know, just, you know, the standard speeches, we got to fight, you know, those are the Southern. That was all they'd want to talk about. It's like,
from Alabama.
Yeah. Some of them were from Alabama.
I know.
Yeah. Mo Brooks is gone now. Anyway, I've probably gone on too long. I will say, considering all of that, and that it's driven by base, it's not surprising that reconciliation becomes a vehicle where you try to do everything. If you actually get unified government, and you've been campaigning on all this fictional stuff, and even the factual you want to get done, policies, you try to jam everything in you can, because it might be your one shot. And that anybody who's worked up there, you're not going to pass up that opportunity, because they don't come along very often, I should say. So let me stop there.
Thank you. So I'd like to welcome to the conversation Pete Guerin and Senator Doug Jones. Pete served at the Department of Defense during the George W. Bush era, including as Secretary of the Army. Also 4 terms in the House representing the great state of Texas. And the question to you is, Congress effective at putting a brake on the presidency?
Well, the Congress has, I don't think intentionally, but it has put a brake on the presidency, and that's why you see the reversion to executive orders and presidential memoranda. So because of the gridlock, it has checked the president's ability to get things done through the congressional process and caused the president to go alternative routes that allow the president to exercise authority outside of the role of Congress. So he has a way to get around the brake. So Congress can put a brake here, but the president has alternative pathways. So it's not an effective brake. And in the area of national security and international affairs, the Congress tends to cower at any time the president of either party shows an initiative internationally. You'll have a handful that will stand up and speak against it, but by and large, the Congress sees itself as taking a back seat. So I don't see a real meaningful check there, not in real time anyway.
Is it your sense that members of Congress are not addressing these outdated authorizations for the use of military force because they don't want to own a vote for military action at some point?
I don't think Congress worries about owning a vote for military action, because so much military action happens without really even serious consideration of having a vote in the Congress. I was there when President Bush 41 came to the Congress and asked the Congress to vote on the Iraq War. I thought that was the right thing for the president to do. It was a very close vote. You know, we look back and the war was successful and didn't last long, but it was a very tight vote in the Congress, and it could have gone either way. A couple of things broke at the last minute. But that process worked so well, and it brought everybody together. Everybody spoke their mind. It was emotional, very passionate, fierce. We were talking about tens of thousands of casualties. But once the vote took place, the Congress came together. The carping, the backstabbing stopped right there. So that's the way it ought to work. The president makes decisions so quickly now in the face of international situations that the Congress is really checked out in most of that, and I don't think they worry about taking a vote as much as this is just a presidential prerogative that's just gotten so well established in the country and well established in the Congress. You can't get ahead of the president on those either. He is so much more nimble, moves so much more quickly, and Congress is a spectator unless something drags on for a long time.
Senator Doug Jones represented the great state of Alabama from 2018 to 2021 during the Trump era. The question is, were you guys effective in putting a brake on the presidency at times?
Effective some, ineffective other times, no. I think that there's a difference between whether Congress can, in the sense of procedure. Sure, the Constitution gives them that authority, but can they or will they, from a just political standpoint, I think it's a completely different question. And what we have seen in the last few years especially is that you've got one side of the aisle that just refuses, by and large, to go against anything that the president of their own party says. That, I think, is a little bit of a problem. It was a problem in the Trump administration. And what we saw with Trump especially, and I try to study history as much as I can, but I don't remember a time when a president literally threatened people's, in primary elections if they challenged his authority. And I think that that's a huge problem. And I see that problem not negating. And I'd like to mention a couple of things, because there's themes running through the first panel and this one a little bit, and that is, the polarization. And to a large extent, I agree with Josh that is, as much as anything, people are polarized. But I don't want to put all the blame on voters with that, because we have so gerrymandered districts, not just in Congress, but city council districts at a local level, county commission districts at a local level, state house, state senate districts, and all of that gerrymandering has this effect. It permeates through the entire state, so that even though Alabama is only gerrymandered per its state boundaries, it becomes the gerrymandered state. And we're seeing that a lot more. And the voters, I think, reflect a lot of what candidates and politicians are saying. They are appealing to a base of voters, and they stoke that. And then when voters see members of Congress in the House and in the Senate on the floor, and they're not debating bills, they're debating each other. They're debating Republicans versus Democrats. In my final speech on the Senate floor, I implored my colleagues to quit using the term negotiating between the White House and the Senate, to quit negotiating and using the term negotiating between Republicans and Democrats, because people out there are looking at that and saying, who the hell's negotiating for us, the American people? Everything is seen in a political term. So I think it makes it really difficult for people in one party to check a president in their own political party in today's world. And I think we can address that some if we can get away from political gerrymandering. And the final thing I would say right now, and I've got to say this because I apologize, I will not be able to be here tomorrow when you discuss solutions, which is really too bad because everybody knows that senators know how to solve everything. But the one thing I want to address, because it's very personal, and not because I've been a victim, although there is one guy that went to prison for a call he made to my office. I think that the violence that we're seeing, political violence and the rhetoric we're seeing, is really dangerous. And the poll that everybody has referred to is a really dangerous place for this country to be. But it's understandable. I mean, it's saddening, but it's understandable when Democrats demonize Republicans and Republicans demonize Democrats as destroying the country. People have this inherent will to fight for their families, to fight for their country. And we don't have this ability to call out the rhetoric that we're seeing when it's being challenged. And I really do hope that at some point the Miller Center and others will really focus a lot on what we're seeing of the rise of the political rhetoric and violence and this attitude among the public that we're going to have to stand up and take arms and not call out. When a former governor of Arkansas says that if Donald Trump loses this election, then the next election will be decided by bullets, there is a problem. There is a real problem in this country because he has a megaphone. And I just wanted to get that out because I may not have another chance. And again, I took the senatorial prerogative of saying what the hell I want to say instead of answering the question. So thank you very much.
Mike, can I make one comment?
Yes, sir.
And this poll we're talking about, the 40% roughly of Republicans and Democrats, I believe, resorting to violence to oppose your political opponent. I bet if you took, that's self-identified Republicans and self-identified Democrats. I bet if you looked at the people that actually voted in primaries, I bet the number's a lot higher. And so you go home and the people you talk to are the groups of people that number is a lot higher. And that's who shows up at the town halls, that's who votes in the primaries. So there's just a ugliness, evil spirit out there And I think, frankly, that poll, if these numbers are persistent, it tells us, warns us of a bigger threat to democracy than January 6th. I mean, if there are that many people out there on hair trigger, and whatever percentage of it is of primary voters, that's a very frightening scenario.
Especially when the candidates who are going to those primary voters know that,
Yeah.
and they're trying to get that vote. That goes back to the gerrymandering that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But I totally agree with you.
Can I just throw out one thing? There actually is a lot of scholarship that shows that there's a tremendous number of moderates within the mass public. And I don't want us to overstate the extent to which there's polarization within the larger public. There's a lot of careful research showing as much, there's a lot of good work that shows that the willingness of people to come out and say, I'm willing to take up arms, oftentimes is a function of partisan cheerleading. It's not that we are really on the brink of something called that we might think of as being a civil war. That how you frame these questions and the opportunities you give people to articulate their objections to the opposite side, if the only opportunity you give them is to say, in the context of a survey, yeah, I think violence is, but we shouldn't take that literally. That's not to say that political violence isn't a real thing, but to say that 80% of the country is ready to take up arms, to my mind, vastly overstates the predicament.
40%
Mischaracterized.
Republicans and 40%.
Yeah. So, but so you don't add them up. Yeah, I get you, but we're not. Yeah.
But it is a warning. It is a warning because it's growing, and we have seen people shot at baseball practice for Congress. We have seen the wife of, the husband of the Speaker of the House attacked with a hammer. We have seen that, and people are willing more and more. And I think it's the warning that we've got to be cognizant of and talk about now. That's just, that was my point, William. I agree with you about.
All right, let me bring in the.
Is going to go home remembering Francis's remarks more than any others that we hear today. Thank you for that.
Let me bring in the next two panelists. Chris Liddell, who was brought in to do the transition for President Trump and stayed with President Trump till the very end of his administration, and Don Baer, who served in a number of senior posts with the Clinton administration. Chris, so the question is, what does a president need from Congress, and in your view, is he getting it?
Sure, thanks. So if I just frame the way that I think about the answer and then work my way towards the specific answer, when I see a massive issues like we have facing us, I think it's important to think of, to dissect them. And the way that I would think about how we do that is look for problems whose solutions meet three basic tests. Are they good for the country? Are they meaningful? And are they doable? Good for the country, I guess, means it's got to, by definition, be bipartisan. Meaningful, I think, self-explanatory. But the doable, I'm a how person. I spent all my life getting things done. The how is probably the interesting one because it needs to meet two-part test. It needs to have a pathway to getting done, and it needs to have incentives aligned. And we talked a bit about incentives in the last session. I think it's incredibly important because if you don't have the incentives between the Republican Party and the Democrat Party aligned, then it's unlikely to happen. And if you don't have the incentives where the responsibility is shared between the President and whoever else it might be, Congress, the agencies, etc., aligned, then it's also unlikely to happen. So I look for problems that fit into that. And so the first and most important one for me is the effectiveness of the executive office of the President. And I think without what I describe as the head and the heart of the government effective, then everything else is, broadly speaking, irrelevant. And I worked most of my life in the private sector. When you make the central body more or less effective, it's plus or minus 10%. It's important, but it's not the most important thing. In the White House, in my experience, it's plus or minus 100%. The opportunity set is just huge. And what does effectiveness mean in the executive office of the President? Obviously, we can debate that as a concept. But to me, it's the quality of the decisions and the quantity. So we talked in the last session about the quantity. Just the volume that the White House has to deal with means that it has to be nimble enough to deal with a multiplicity of issues. And we're seeing that in the world at the moment, both in the foreign stage and the domestic stage. So the White House just simply has to have the ability to do a certain volume. And then the quality. And the quality, I'd say, is in two areas. One, the quality of the actual decisions, and secondly, the implementation. Most White Houses are okay on the first, very poor on the second. So implementation is a skill that most White Houses don't have. So the effectiveness of the executive office of the president, to me, is one of the most fundamental opportunities that we face. And conveniently, it passes all three tests. It's incredibly meaningful. It's bipartisan in nature. The opportunity exists for either side of the aisle. And it's doable, not only because these are nuts and bolts of how you run a proper organization, but it's the one thing that the president basically has unilateral control over. Everything else we're going to talk about, he or she eventually. But with the exception of a few appointments which are Senate confirmed inside the executive office of the president, effectively 100% of the people are appointed unilaterally, and how they are organized is there. So it meets all three tests. It's the single biggest opportunity. Having passed that, then the question becomes, how does that effectiveness actually used, to get to your question? So we get to legislation and the relationship with the Congress. I think Francis's paper is really compelling, that the single biggest opportunity from a legislative point of view is what I describe as legacy legislation, which by definition she proves is likely to be bipartisan. So you can solve some things by reconciliation, but they're likely to be budgetary and monetary of nature, unlikely to survive multiple administrations. The true legacy policy is likely to be bipartisan and outside the reconciliation process. Does it pass the tests? I think that's where it gets interesting. Clearly it's meaningful. It's the most significant thing that a president can do in 4 years or 8 years, depending on how long. It's clearly good for the country because of its legacy legislation. It's something that moves the country forward on a significant basis and hopefully bipartisan. I think the issue is around incentives and doability. And the interesting aspect here, I think, is that the time at which the incentives align with each other are certain windows. And it's very important to think about legislation from a window and a chronological perspective as opposed to just across the whole 4 years. And there's basically 1.5 windows to get legacy legislation done. In the first year, in particular the first 6 months, and then the third year, depending on the midterm elections. But most particularly, let's just assume, because the midterm elections generally speaking go against the incumbent, you have one window, and that one window is the first 6 months to a large extent. If you look at the history of the last half dozen or so presidents, the amount of legacy legislation that's been passed in the first 6 months that isn't a response to a crisis is essentially zero. So most administrations ramp up their legislative ability in the first 6 months because they're figuring out how to run the country. And they're consumed by the ineffectiveness of the executive office of the president. So to me, the biggest single place to look for, to answer your specific question, opportunities is in that short window. And that's a technical issue because that's not about how you bring people together, although that's obviously a challenge, because it's also the place where the incentives of Congress meet the president. Before the people who are in Congress start to think about their re-election, they have a honeymoon period where they're actually thinking more about the country than their re-election. So, but in order to actually achieve something in that first 6 months, we need to reimagine the way in which we actually pass legislation, and that's about preparation and about working with Congress before you're elected as opposed to when you're elected, and the big wave of governance comes over the top of you. And it's also, to my first point, about having an effective executive office of the president so that you aren't consumed by the inevitable crises that happen as well. So that's the specific one. The other one that I'll say is a smaller issue, but I think an important one from the work that I do, is the interregnum, the actual transition period, as most people traditionally think about it, between the election and the inauguration. And it's what I describe as the time of maximum vulnerability for the country. If you ever wanted to mess with the United States, the time to do it is when the outgoing administration is atrophying because people are leaving, and the incoming administration is trying to figure out how they run it. So there's a specific point where we need more legislative control. It also meets the tests as far as I'm concerned. It's less of an issue than a legacy policy point of view, but I think it's incredibly important from a country point of view, and it's also an area of potential solutions between the president and Congress.
Don Baer, what about your view in terms of what a president needs from Congress, and whether or not President Clinton, in your experience, got it from Congress.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. I want to thank Bill and the team here at the center for having me. I'm looking out that window, and about half a football field away, I lived as a law student at the University of Virginia, and like Josh, I think of myself much more as a student than a teacher here, and I was an erratic law student, so I hope this works out better than that. Let me just say, the one thing that presidents need from Congress and that Congress needs from presidents is partnership. And what do we mean? What do I mean by partnership? Well, what do we mean by the spirit and the practice of partnership? We mean that there are more incentives, there are more rewards to work together than there are to work in opposition, than there are to attack and obstruct. There's a greater belief, because of those rewards, that you are more likely to be serving the people. We call them stakeholders in the private sector, the people who put you where you are. And to the point that was made earlier about re-election, which whether it's every 6 years, every 2 years, or every 4 years, once, that those who you need to go to in order to win those re-elections are more likely to reward you for the things you do for them and produce for them than those things that you stop. I have worked the great bulk of my career in the private sector. I was a lawyer for 3 years, 5 months, and 3 days in New York, harkening back to living in that apartment complex. I was a journalist for a decade, including a national political reporter and White House correspondent before, improbably, as those who worked with me in the Clinton administration know, I wound up as the head of speech writing and then the White House communications director. So yes, I was one of those people that Elaine Kmark was complaining about before. And she was right there with me, by the way. And then I have worked for the last 25 years entirely in the private sector and working with businesses of all types. And in business, in the private sector, partnering is what wins. And obstructing and attacking is what always loses. And so I don't know how we get back to that. In fact, I'm not 100% sure, though I have my theories of the case as to what we lost. But to the point about President Clinton, first off, I would say he understood, as I think most of our presidents, frankly, in the last 50 years have well understood, that partnership with Congress and frankly within one's own administration and across the country, including with state houses and localities, is critically important to make it all work. But he used to say that being president was a lot like being a cemetery director. You have a lot of people under you, but nobody's listening. A big part of what presidents do and have had to do increasingly in a world of more intense partisanship is figure out how to get more people to listen. And I could spend hours on States of the Union and all of the things that go along with that. But I think unless and until we find a way to rebalance the incentives and the ways that enough people who have a part of this process appreciate and understand that, to invoke President Kennedy, the rising tide is going to lift more boats, or all boats. We are not going to get back to it. And I want to say this about the polarization. Yes, the people in this country are deeply polarized. And yes, they are deeply polarized for real reasons that we can't dismiss. It's not all stagecraft. It's not all just what they hear on cable television and elsewhere. But leadership matters. The words of leaders matter. How leaders behave matter. And President Clinton never gave a major speech, never gave a major State of the Union or inaugural address, where the fundamental underlying thing was that we are one America, and we have to find our way to be one America. Now, those are just words. because we have to put the actions behind the words and have more of the people in this country come to believe that they're all in it together also. And I think until leadership really steps up to do that, even opposing and in the face of national leaders who basically the incentives for them are to divide the country, because when the country is divided, they are more likely to hold power. We're not going to be able to overcome this.
All right, let's welcome in the three panelists at the end of the table. L.F. Payne, a former congressman representing the Commonwealth of Virginia, what used to be known as a Blue Dog Democrat. Barbara Comstock, Republican, represented the Commonwealth of Virginia, actually was my member of Congress. Great to see you again. And Fred McClure, who served in Leg Affairs under President Bush 41 and President Reagan. So welcome to all three of you. LF, let's start with you. What about Congress's power of the purse, and is it used effectively?
Well, Mike, thank you very much for including me and Bill Antholis and the Miller Center, and my congratulations to the Miller Center that I think has become known as the preeminent institution in this country that's studying the presidency, and so it's an honor for me to certainly be here today. As to your question about the power of the purse, I think Congress does have the power of the purse. It's the biggest power they have in terms of being able to effect policy and effect presidency. I think members of Congress recognize, as I did when I was there and still do, that the framers of the Constitution in Article 1 set up the Congress of the United States, and then in Article 2 set up the presidency, and so we always thought that the framers thought we were more important in Congress than the president and presidency, certainly. However, as we look around today, we recognize that the public and others, the president and presidency is the preeminent organization, if you will, and how Americans think about their politics and their government. And the Congress has, as has been said earlier, seemingly often is sitting on the sidelines, even though they do have power such as the power of the purse. So I've always been an advocate that Congress ought to look at how it claws back its power. The Miller Center did a great job of looking at the War Powers Act, for instance, and did a nice job. And Senator Tim Kaine now has a bill in the Senate that I think one day will pass. And those are the things that can happen that can claw back power, if you will, as it was intended in the Constitution. However, this week, as I said and watched the split screen of the President of the United States being in Israel and doing things that I think most all Americans could be very proud of, and then the other side of the screen is the Congress trying its best somehow to come up with a speaker and being totally ineffective. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine that you can make a particularly good case for taking power away from the presidency and giving it to the Congress. I think in spite of what the power that it has been given, including the power of the purse, there's a real imperative that the Congress be reformed and that the Congress become the effective body that it should be. And that won't happen until, as we've heard so many people talk about, that we learn how to deal with in a bipartisan way. The Congress was established so that you had people who would have different ideas come together, but they would be able to collaborate, then compromise, then come up with specific legislation, and then that would be passed by both houses and go to the president to be signed. The incentives today, though, it seems, are not such that you get people in Congress who are incented to do that. They're incented more to come to Congress having vowed if they are elected, they will not compromise and they will not collaborate, and that the other party is the enemy and they're not going to be a part of it. And so structurally, you have a situation where Congress can't succeed to the extent that you're having more and more people like that show up who really aren't able to collaborate, to work together as we need to. So to Don's point, I think Josh made the point, others, that we need to find incentives so that the people who are sent to Congress are incented not to say no and to not compromise, but just the opposite, to work together, and that compromise is a good thing and not a bad thing. And I think until we find a way to begin to work at and make those things happen, both structurally within the Congress itself, where members now are not working together and really don't know each other and don't trust each other, that needs to be better. And then those folks need to be leaders and talk to their constituents and let them know that working together is in fact a positive and good thing, and that's how things get done within the Congress.
Barbara, my view is that the polarization on the Hill has made budgeting next to impossible. Now we do continuing resolution after continuing resolution. Your thoughts on Congress and the power of the purse, and whether you're in effect giving up that power by just kind of punting and doing extensions a few months at a time?
Well, it's a real problem for, I think particularly for national security emergencies. I mean, you look at, things like, after 9/11, you obviously had to change, what you're dealing with in situations. So, continuing resolution after continuing resolution really makes it difficult for planning. And I know in 2017, General Mattis, I think wrote a whole memo for John McCain talking about how, this really made it difficult to, for long-term planning for the military. I know, having represented a lot of people, a lot of military contractors, how difficult it made it for them. And I heard that all the time. The government shutdowns were a huge problem in that regard. And so it drove me crazy, certainly hearing on my side, and you certainly hear it all the time from Republicans, it doesn't matter if we shut down the government. And the guy who represents this district, unfortunately, if we shut down the government, Bob Good tells you it doesn't matter. They don't do anything anyway. They get a vacation. But what it means, the last government shutdown, which was authored by Jim Jordan, who I'm happy to say has just announced, they've announced that he's not standing for a third vote. And surprise, surprise, the guy.
Barbara Comstock breaking news here.
Yes,
wow.
Happy to announce it. The guy who never passed a bill in 16 years found that it was really hard to pass a bill, and he was better at killing them. And just imagine, he couldn't get to 218 because bills are about relationships and putting together coalitions and trying to get people across the aisle and things to work together, and he wasn't able to do it. And there were people who were able to adopt his practices and thwart things. So at any rate, they are doing the Patrick McHenry temporary thing until January 1st, apparently, is what they're doing. But at any rate, yes, these government shutdowns, the last one cost $11 billion. So the guys who tell you they want to be conservative and want to cut budgets every time they shut down the government cost billions and billions of dollars. So yes, it's irresponsible to not have that type of budgeting. So being a conservative, somebody who wants to have military budgets increase at a time when we need to do things like support Ukraine, because when we're just donating, doing maybe what is it, 3, 4, 5% of our military budget is going to Ukraine, and we're decimating 50% of Russia's military budget without putting our boys and girls in harm's way. That seems like a pretty good deal, and that way it's not going into NATO countries where we would have to put our men and women in harm's way. That is a really good deal, and yet we have the Freedom Caucus, again, people who don't understand those threats, don't understand how that would cost us so much more. So once again, I think we have really dodged a bullet without having this isolationist caucus, not having one an insurrectionist who could have been our speaker. Fortunately, God bless those 22 members who said no. But I would like to address, I know I'm a little bit off budget, but we were talking about, Dan was talking about how, you go back to your district and you hear these people who want to impeach and want to do all these things in the partisanship. But I was listening to the news this morning, and they were talking about how President Biden couldn't go and have that stop in, I guess it was Jordan. He had to call off that stop. And he had to call it off because of the misreporting by the news of the bombing of the Gaza hospital. And so all the people thought it was Israel that bombed the hospital, when of course it wasn't. Well, and so you have...
To be fair, there were also some members of Congress who said it was Israel.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so, and that was exactly where I was going on this.
I'm here for you.
You have, yes. So now you have, this is the Arab street, right? This is what the Arab street thinks. So you have the Arab leaders now saying, well, this is what the Arab street thinks. So they're all saying, well, the Arab street thinks this, so that's what we're going to think. Well, we now have a MAGA street. So the MAGA street thinks the elections were stolen. And the MAGA street says this. So when our people go out there, what do 200 people have to say? They have to support Jim Jordan, who still wouldn't say that Joe Biden won the election, that the election wasn't stolen. So 200 of our members had to vote for Jim Jordan, who says the election was stolen, and wouldn't say to Ken Buck, and he wouldn't say to French Hill, who asked him, can't you just say, Ken Buck said, I'll vote for him if he will just tell me the election wasn't stolen, and he wouldn't say that. So we have, excuse me, because this makes me crazy, we have the equivalent of a, Arab street here in this country, because we have the press who reports that still, we have, the War Room, and we have other networks too who report that, and the Kraken lady who went on various networks and said all these things, and we have, Steve Bannon and everyone else who are making threats against some of our members, and I think the count is getting up there today because I guess a few more people reported death threats this morning because they were getting pressure put on them. And that's one of the many reasons there were more people this morning who were going to not vote for Jim Jordan. But we now have a MAGA street that is threatening our people and threatening the truth. So as I sat there listening to this morning, I thought, we need to have more of our members of Congress and our press who will push back on these people. So when people are running for office, they can go back and say, no, I'm not going to just repeat this back to you. And it doesn't have to just be Adam Kinzinger. And it doesn't have to be, because some of these 22 members who push back, they're going to retire. Some of them had already planned to retire. Some of them now probably will retire because of what they were willing to do. But, one of the reasons you have to do this is you have to have reverence for these institutions. I know when I went in there, I came in third grade and went to Congress, and visited. And my mom was a teacher. And the reason I wanted to serve there was because I had these reverence for the institutions. And, I know that's how Liz Cheney felt. I know that's how Adam felt. And they thought there would be more people behind them. And a lot of them just said, I am not, they just weren't scared they wouldn't get reelected. They were scared physically. And that is going on to this day, that they're scared to death. And, that's, our staff are scared. And, I know my staff were scared. When I voted against repealing Obamacare, because I had dopes like Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows go down to the White House and say, we had the bill all worked out, and then they said, no, we don't want to have the pre-existing conditions. I don't know if you were there, Dan. We had it all worked out, and we were going to have sorry, I know I'm going over my time, but we had we always said we were going to keep pre-existing conditions in there. We're going to repeal Obamacare, but not without keeping the pre-existing conditions in there. But then, God bless him, Mark Meadows, and he was the worst chief of staff ever, and you can thank him for Donald Trump losing, and I do every day. Thank Mark Meadows for being the worst chief of staff ever, getting indicted and everything. But he took that out, and that's why the repeal of Obamacare lost. And so those of us who voted against the repeal, we told the vice president, hey, we would have been with you, but they took that out. And they all came in and said, no, you got to vote for it, you got to vote for it. I said, no, we're not going to vote it. So we started getting all those hate calls too. They said, we're not going to give you re-election vote. I said, I don't care, I don't care. I got the death threats, I got the attacks, and my staff all got yelled at, and we got called into leadership. The vice president's calling, and I was like, you know, I'm not going to lie to my voters, do whatever you want. But we've got to, so there you go, that's my lecture. But, you know, the press needs, you know, whether it's the press on, you know, reporting about who blew up what or whatever, you guys in the guys in the press have to report this accurately, but our members of Congress also have to stop lying, whether it's, you know, about what happens on the Arab street or what happens on our streets here at home. And so when I saw that this morning, I thought, this is what's happening here at home, and it's happening there. And these are exactly the same things, but we all do the whataboutism. And there's only a few of us, like Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, who can be pure on both sides. So that's my lecture for today.
All right, Fred McClure, I'm confident the
I reserve my time.
As you should. I am confident the fights were intense during the Reagan and Bush 41 era. What are your reflections on that and what you see today?
First, I'd like to thank Elaine and Tom for being here, having served earlier than I did in a presidential administration. And thanks, Bill, and the team here for putting us together and the chance to be here. I was sort of in a different era and time when I was working for both Reagan and also the 41st president, George Bush. Remember when Reagan became president, the Republican control of the Senate of the United States had not occurred since 1954. So this was kind of a new deal in 1981 once Reagan became president and the Senate changed. And then on the House side, even though Democrats controlled the House with Speaker O'Neill, there was a significant number of blue dog Democrats, now all known as Republicans, blue dog Democrats who were there for us to call upon. So and the Republican Party in the Senate at the time was considerably mixed with a number of Northeastern senators who were more moderate. So trying to weave those kinds of victories together was pretty difficult. But it did result, for example, in the Tax Reform Act of 1986. So this was sort of the beginning of the shift of the makeup of the Congress, which had an impact upon President Reagan's ability to deal with them. The upside that he kind of had going for him, though, was after President Carter's tenure, inflation was high. You know, we didn't know what was going to happen in terms of economy, and he had sort of borne down on that part of the equation. And we had, I thought, very productive years during those first few years because of the result of that makeup of Congress. Then we flipped the switch in '88, and Bush became president, and we had neither the House nor the Senate. And we were lucky if we had enough people to sustain a veto in the event of, which is how we ended up governing, using sort of the negative and going in there. I've kind of grown kind of jaundiced, but I actually had this view a long time ago. To answer the direct question of budgets, all the presidents send up budgets that are dead on arrival.
Sure.
They're just big books,
Yep.
and the big books have lots of numbers in it, and hopefully it begins to express to the Congress and to the American people, voters, what it is a president has in mind. And mind you, this comes after somebody else has been president immediately before him, particularly when you're changing administrations. So they kind of have to decide how badly they want to throw the guys before them under the bus, and on the other hand, how much time they're going to be able to get pieces together that Congress can consider. My other view is that Congress really, other than some really big things, Congress only has like one thing to do, which is pass appropriations bills, and they don't do that very well.
Right.
There are 13 of them. Normally, we end up doing them in reconciliation, or we do them in CRs and continuing resolutions, and it once again is sort of like an abdication of that responsibility since they control the purse. Most of the time, particularly during the Reagan days and then the Bush days to follow, there were opportunities to have policy decisions wrapped up in the appropriations bills. I mean, there were 5 of the 13 appropriations bills, I think, that have some reference to abortion. So how do you go through that part of the equation, whether it's on military installations, whether it's payments from HHS, whether it's medical services provided there. And that was always what was coursing through. Then we found a way to get guns in there and all the other cultural things as we were making those kinds of shifts. We, meaning Congress and administration, got there. Now you have a whole nother world as a result of the Dodds decision, and so it's opened up a different opportunity for people who want to engage in the cultural wars to have a place to express their policy preferences. I think that's going to continue. I think that's going to continue as long as we don't have a budget process that actually means something other than this is what we would like for it to be. Mm-hmm. These are the floors, these are the ceilings, this is how much you can spend or cannot spend, as they have the continual conflict with the authorizing side of the equation, which basically only happens in the defense space. So that's kind of my cynical view of it. I want to go back to a little bit on the WPA, the War Powers Act, just as an aside. People looked at me and said, you know nothing about national defense, so don't say a word to us. Fine. But I would be remiss if I did not mention what the late Boyden Gray often pontificated on when we were in the Bush administration. Not a single president since Richard Nixon believes that the War Powers Act is constitutional. Believe it's totally unconstitutional. And that's no matter which president it is, Democrat or Republican. But we always manage to find a way to sort of get Congress involved. With George W., it was the AUMF. With us, it was, well, the United Nations is going to do this resolution that we want them to do, and you need to give us authority to do this resolution so that we can go do Desert Storm. So the Congress kind of is a big player in that space, but presidents pay homage appropriately to the Congress because there's this big I word, impeachment. There's this big, we have all the money, we're going to cut you off, so therefore you're going to have to keep coming back to us. One final comment, and William, this goes back to something you saw. I think we're in the midst of a shift, a dramatic shift in this country right now. I think you can look back at the activities and the things that happened in the country that led up to ultimately the Civil War, and you take that piece and you move to the 60s and you talk about what took place leading up to the Civil Rights Movement in this country and all the things that happened after that. I think we're in a third phase, and that third phase probably starts around about George Floyd. I think it manifests itself in some fashion in January 6th, and I do not believe it's going away soon, because of this intense take your corners, this intense everybody is the enemy way in which we are now not only electing our public officials, that is coursing all the way down to local school boards and the things that we see even in Congress today.
I'd like to come back to Louisa and Dan because it seems like in today's politics you have the principals talking to their base, basically, about what they're going to do. But then people like you get into meetings and have to hammer out some kind of agreement. What's that like? Take us behind the curtain, if you don't mind, for a couple minutes.
It was great, wasn't it, Dan? It was fantastic. It was a highlight. No, I think you're absolutely right, because you're trying to be around a table and you're basically looking at each other and be like, what can you sell, right? And you're just iterating all the time on what can you sell, and understanding there's going to be oxygen that's they're going to need to go back to, back to HQ and see what you can sell. I mean, my own view of that is, I know this is like the most trite thing, is that politics are people. And it's sort of the way that you have to do. We kind of came in and there was a lot of long back and forth, really candid, which, obviously happens in lots of negotiations, but I think that helped us all the time have a lot of situational awareness of what was sellable or not. And I think, Dan, you said this too, is you really have to, we had to do some deep listening. Don't assume things about the caucus on the other side, and appreciate a lot of what Mr. McCarthy had to manage there. And I don't know, we ate a lot of good food because of Kevin McCarthy. What else, Dan?
No, I gained a lot of weight. No, I didn't. Yeah, I mean, when you get into these meetings, you come in and you start at the beginning. You're up, you're all geared up to. I made the. If your strategy, and there are people, particularly on our side, who have the strategy that if you just hold your breath long enough, the other side will capitulate. I've never seen work in divided government, by the way, but that's their approach to governing. And you get into a meeting like this, and it becomes pretty clear that doesn't work. And they've got a constituency. And when the meeting started, actually throughout, it was more than a constituency of one, the President of the United States. When we first started the meetings at the staff level, they included the other leaderships, including McConnell and Jeffries and Schumer, and we kind of went as far as we could there, as where there was room to negotiate, and we hit a wall, and from our standpoint, we thought it was really useful to get it just between, we're kind of where McConnell had outlined in the beginning, between the president and the speaker, and we got a deal. But it was not easy, and both sides are disappointing members of their side, their coalition, their base, because again, you don't get the other side. The other side's not going to capitulate to help you out, and. It was a long process on the debt limit, and a lot of hours, but it's not going to happen if you don't have some sort of I'm not going to say catastrophic event, but some sort of an incentive that's important and serious that will happen if you don't get a deal. I mean, it was the same thing when we were doing TARP. We were in meetings where they literally thought the world's economy was about to collapse, and that does provide an incentive to try to get something done.
Probably contributed to some of the gray hair, right?
Yeah, well, I think I had it by then, but yeah.
Chris, you heard the essay about the strongman presidency. What about how much power should a president have?
So,
microphone.
Again, just a reflection on some of the other comments. Thank you. Yeah, reflection on some of the other comments, and then it sort of work my way towards the answer. So I think there's a danger when we look at all this as sort of a woe is me, this is so big, how are we ever going to solve it? And if you try and solve everything, you solve nothing. So when I look at the administrative state and the president's relationship to the agencies as a topic, I think there's a danger that, firstly, that we think of agencies in a homogenous fashion, whereas in fact they're quite heterogeneous. There's ones that provide citizen services, there's ones that regulate the economy, there's some that are national security, there's some that provide regulatory oversight in other areas. And the answer is quite different, I think, in each of those particular categories. It's an oversimplification, but we'll do for the discussion here. if I was looking for areas that sort of fit my framework that I talked about, the area that I would particularly look for is the provision of basic citizen services. Because most people who vote care much more about their daily interface with the government than they care about a lot of the issues we talk about. And it's interestingly one of the issues where I think we can make the most progress, because to a large extent there's some policy differences, but to the extent that we provide services to citizens, most presidents believe that that should be done in the most effective and efficient fashion. It's the area of most opportunity because the basic public services are generally speaking well behind where private sector equivalents are. So there's massive opportunity. Congress is incentivized to do it, and the people who are in the agencies are there because they want to actually do it. So it's a massive opportunity, not only from a significance point of view, which I think actually overwhelms some of the more sexy topics that we like to talk about, but I think is actually incredibly meaningful, generally speaking bipartisan and achievable. So when I think about the president's use of power inside agencies and where we could actually make progress as opposed to reinvent the whole system, I'd look in areas like that.
Don, I'd like to go back to the communication component, particularly in divided government. And it occurs to me, when a president's newly elected, could he or one day she give an address to the people that didn't vote for them to say, I'm your president too, and together we can heal the country, bring the country together, whatever it is? Or is that just, I don't know, pixie dust, thinking about a fantasy world?
Well, I'm often accused of being idealistic, which is another way of saying I'm naive. It's hard to imagine in the world that we're in now, but again, we have to imagine what is hard to imagine. And I long for that. I long for a president who would do that, and also for a president with whom opposition leaders in Congress would stand up when she does that. So, you know, we may get there. I fear, and I think everyone around the table and in the room probably shares the fear, that we're going to go through a couple of worlds of hurt before we get to that moment. And it's a shame that it will take that for us to get there. But we'll see. I mean, look, to give him credit, President Biden has tried to do that. And as I said, he's got to have people who are ready to listen. And it's very hard for one person to do it, even though the voice and the actions of the president resonate far, far more than any other single actor in the whole system. So I don't know. We'll see.
Senator, what about the perpetual campaign mode? Presidents,
You missed it very much, right?
thinking
Is that what
about
you're gonna
re-election. Even senators who have 6-year terms are constantly fundraising.
Yeah.
In the House,
They
it's
like
like,
that.
you got elected, and you better start running right away, because your 2-year term's going to be up in a blink of an eye. What's the impact of that?
I think it's a huge impact. And not only does it take away from the business of government, you lose the ability to really have relationships in the Senate. When I worked in the Senate as a staffer for Senator Howell Heflin from Alabama back in the late 70s, you know, they stayed in Washington. They went home maybe once a month. Their families were up there. And I know we hear that all the time, but I'm telling you, it made a difference. Because when I came to the Senate, you know, we're in there Monday night. We've got committee hearings, and you don't have an interaction in a committee hearing. You go in, and you got to go to another committee hearing at the same time, and you're going back and forth. Then you vote, and the only interaction you have is either at something like the prayer breakfast on a Wednesday morning or during votes. You know, people, I used to use votes to try to talk to people, because it was the only time to have an interaction. Otherwise, you're running, you've got to get over to the DSCC to make phone calls. You've got to go to receptions at night in which you're raising money for you or for somebody else. And those times on the Senate floor, I know that I'm talking to somebody and I'm trying to get them to help me, but they're out there raising money to try to get me beat, when they really didn't have to raise a lot of money to get me beat, okay, in Alabama. But, it's a different world. And I made a point of not campaigning against a Republican colleague. Very few people will do that right now. There were plenty of Democrats who did that, and so I didn't have to. But I think the politics have gotten such, and they are so intense, and it is so expensive. And Tom Donilon talked a little bit about social media earlier. That's another whole day-long kind of topic that you can get for social media, and both the misinformation, the disinformation, and just the way people get their messages today. We talk about the voters at the town halls. They're not informed with that. They believe Joe Biden should be impeached because that's what they're seeing, and they don't really do the research. They don't have the staffs to do the research on those things. So it's tough. I wish we could figure out a way to dial the campaigning back and keep people in Washington a little bit more, not criticize them for being in Washington a little bit more, because that's where the real government is going to work, and develop these relationships not only within their caucuses but across the aisle. Personal relationships mean so much in Washington, D.C. And I'll never forget Lamar Alexander was talking, and he said, you know, and this is what I think most people would agree with, in that sphere of the Capitol, in the dome of the Capitol in both houses, it is probably, when you could close the doors and get the cameras turned off, probably one of the most bipartisan places in America. You get outside of that is when you run into problems, and people succumb to that because they want to get reelected, and that's their driving force. And the last thing I'll say is I do think that there could be some changes if more people thought more about the country and making democracy work, as opposed to just simply their reelection or their party. I just don't think we have enough of that in Congress, and that's just kind of a personal thing that we have to look to for leadership.
And with that, I think we have to leave it there. Thank you all panelists for a fascinating discussion. I'm grateful to you for doing a first-class job. And heartfelt thanks to Bill Antholis, the Miller Center, and his dynamic team for doing a first-class job in putting on a great event. We're going to take a lunch break. More programming after the break.